Whenever we talk about the question of caste, we can't help but know and grapple with that so much of discourse, so much of text has been written on caste, and they definitely inform our knowledge, and they add to our knowledge. But at the same time, we also feel that all the information, all the interpretation or the political text regarding caste and how to grapple with particularly the problem of the caste inequality leading to widespread social inequality, how to make sense of it today, especially since 2014 we will see widespread caste atrocities committed against the members of lower caste, constitutionally defined as scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Dalit women, the Dalit being a political category used by the community themselves. When we see all this widespread nature of caste inequality and its social exclusion that it leads to, the discrimination it causes, we can't help but bring ourselves together to go back to certain text which is important to underline in our times. At the same time, try to work out a path, a kind of a roadway ahead, because we can see instead of resolving the caste tension, instead of diminishing the caste inequalities, what we see all the assertion and all the widespread nature of social inequality is getting more and more pronounced. So, what is it? First thing which I must underline here, that whenever we talk about caste, whenever we engage with the question of caste, it is not the question of caste as a singular. It is caste is always been seen as plural. It's been argued and written by Ambedkar in many of his texts. And many of the time when we talk about caste, it is a problem of the lower caste, a problem of the upper caste. It always, we get the sense that the person or the author or the scholar or the anybody who brings the question of caste is somehow trying to bring out a picture that caste is happening something out there in the village to somebody who is backward, who is the victim of caste. But the thing which we tend to forget, that caste cannot function or operate on a standalone basis. Caste happens, and caste, the importance of caste can only be realized in a system of caste. Another word of understanding that is caste system as graded inequality, where people are pegged. Somebody is at an upper pedestal, somebody lower pedestal, and there's always somebody at the lower pedestal, yeah, where everybody has an interest to work this system. This is, I'm not going into the detail about how caste system works, the four division of Varna Vyavastha and the Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, and Dalits being outcast there, and so on and so forth. The point I'm trying to drive here is that we must recognize and understand that whenever we talk about social exclusion, discrimination emanating from caste, it is emanating from the caste system. And there's a large number of people who has an interest in strengthening this system. Now, coming back to this thing, this social inequality, which we clearly see is very widespread, and along with social inequality, the inequality based on class income in terms of resources, which brings some economic parity among the people. These two questions are broadly the two central questions of politics everywhere. It's just not in India. In most of the country, any politics grapple with the question of inequality, which is social in nature, and inequality which is in the nature of income groups. Now, in India, the social inequality trumps every other inequality, because you see, somebody being born as SCs and STs, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, are bound to be stricken by poverty much more than somebody just being in some from, say, backward region of our country. The social identity, the social location of a person determines his income category as well. So, having said that, the inequality which is social in nature, is very widespread, is very ubiquitous, and we clearly see its impact in the political realm as well. It defines our today's politics. But other than caste affecting the social and the political, it also affects our society at a much deeper psychological level. And that's where I want to speak about a bit more, because this is something which we have not been able to grapple with, we have not been able to articulate it in a bigger way. And we see, despite of having progressive policies, progressive constitution, we have progressive social movements, somehow the impact and the grip of caste is not being diminished. Is rather it's being asserted. It goes on to function. It nowhere it looks that that there's this. The big demon of caste is anywhere in the decline. So, what is the psychological impact of the caste? It's basically is that people deeply believe in caste system because this system provides a huge number of population, which not in terms of a numerical sense, and that's why they've been talk about having a caste census, but in terms of people who hold economic resources, in terms of people who hold economic property and enjoy a kind of a hegemony in a social and economic sense, and they have an interest to uphold this caste as system. So this idea of caste having a psychological impact, we have to understand how this thing affect our society in general and our polity in general, and especially if we look at since 2014, the kind of ideological assertion which is met at the behest of the current government led by BJP and with the ideological support of RSS, it's become all the more important to understand the nature of the psychological hold of a particular kind of politics, which I called as politics of prejudice. Prejudice, in a sense, defined by where people want to hold on to the privilege offered by the caste system. See, caste system is not all about inequality. That it, of course, it is, but while on one hand it keep a huge number of population of a country at a very economic substance level and lower than that, while on the other hand it gives a huge kind of an privilege, entitlement and power, with power both in social and political sense, to a numerously smaller group, but they enjoy a lot of political clout and they're in position to influence each and every policy and the political outlook of the country at a given point of time. Now, especially since 2014, I'm saying, which Professor Christopher Zaffelet talks about as a revolt of upper caste, I would say that this sense of ideological hegemony has always been there. However, the check which has been empowered by the constitutional mechanism and the progressive policies that flows from the mandate of the constitution has been able to dissolve this caste tension, has been able to uplift at least a substantial or a sizable section among the lower caste to a certain degree where people have been saying the changes being made in our society. However, all these things have come to almost near zero in the sense that the rising atrocities against Dalit women, and the attack on reservation, which again flows from the constitutional mandate, reduced number of seats in higher education, reduced number of fund allocations and spatial allocation plans for SCs and STs upliftment, and the way it's been going on, any statistician and economist will tell you that in more detail. The skewed nature of funding of the government in terms of higher education and other important schemes which are there for the upliftment of poor in general and SC/ST in particular. All these things tells us that something has happened since 2014 which has brought this nature of prejudice, which has always been there in the society, which affects all of us psychologically, and that has seeped into politics. Now, how that happened, it's not happening for past, say, 7-8 years. There's the process which has always been there in this country. It's just that they have gotten ideological support and the mandate to assert it in public, assert it in open. So this politics of prejudice is happening through our families, happening through our education institutions. And what something you see, a French philosopher has said that ideological state apparatus, which sometimes works in a very, very nuanced manner, even if the government doesn't control it, these apparatus plays a very crucial role in sustaining a particular social ideological belief system, which helps the majority, quote unquote majority, which helps the majority sentiments to be in power. And the moment such powerful people who are benefited with this kind of prejudice politics in a concrete manner, BJP, RSS in our country, it has been very, very open and very, very blatant rather, since 2014 especially. This entrenched prejudice and its grip on our social reality, which has definitely seeped into politics. How does that happen? Uh, One way to understand is this: in order to counter the progressive aspects of our constitution, in order to counter the achievements which have been made in past 70 years, 70 plus few years, which flows from constitution, how does one counter that? So what I call it is basically mobilized theory of prejudice, where prejudice is mobilized and mobilized in a certain way where not only it diverts people's attention from the progressive aspects of our politics, which of course flows from constitution, it also creates an alternative where people gradually start believing in the sense that this is the make-believe world which is much required, which sometimes being filled by the ideology of nationalism, sometimes being filled by the ideology of the cultural nationalism, where Hindutva plays an important role. And it becomes very difficult for progressive people, for the people who wants betterment of all, to counter such narrative. The mobilization of prejudice to the political ends, and that then hence in this way giving birth to politics of prejudice. When it happens, when prejudice, which exists at the psychological level, which anyway is present in widespread in our society, when this feeling of prejudice turn itself into political force, then it becomes very, very difficult to grapple with. I, for one, think that constitutional mechanism of policies which has been there in the place through the different various government at the central level, all becomes very shaky, all become something which are not on the priority list by the people themselves. It's not just the government, it's only the government who wants to take care of all these benefits. But when the prejudice turns itself into political force, all these benefits and the important policy achievements of the past 70 few years looks like these are not very important things, and something the entire people's mobilization happens towards a very, very narrow end, guided by the politics of prejudice. Now, how this prejudice, which exists nonetheless at a level of a society where people hold prejudice against a minority community, where people hold prejudice against a member of Dalits, where people hold prejudice against any marginalized section other than the caste Hindus and the people who are privileged. How that idea, which is anyway quotidian and everyday, how that idea turns itself into a overwhelming political force is something we have to understand. We have to understand how this politics of prejudice function if we want to counter it. Now, one way to understand is this: the politics of prejudice has been able to assert itself because the ideology which has sustained it has always been there. And that ideology is clearly the ideology of Brahminism, and another mild way of putting it is the ideology of vegetarianism, and which is a very wrong way to put it. People many times see the ongoing Hindutva, tornado in terms of it is the will of majority, which is a very wrong way to understand how the majority politics function and what constitute majority. This is definitely not majority. Majority of the people in this country are downtrodden, working class, marginalized, other weaker section. The minuscule section of the caste Hindus who's doing everything in their power, in their privilege, to maintain that caste as system, to maintain their position of privilege and power and entitlement, is definitely not majoritarianism. However, this majority enjoys the hegemony of an ideology which has also been accepted, endorsed, and conceded by the section of the people who are victim of this ideology. So that's how hegemony works. Hegemony doesn't only work by somebody's force and forceful imposition. Hegemony can only succeed when it gets an ascension of people. It gets the consent of people. So in that way, we have to understand Brahminism, which is the ideology behind the politics of prejudice. How does that has taken roots, which always had a broad presence, but in today's time, how does that affect our everyday lives and everyday politics? Now, the impact of politics of prejudice is one way which I was trying to say earlier as Christopher Zeffel has said, there's a revolt of upper caste, which has been completely frustrated by the upward mobility of Dalits, thanks to the politics of social justice and reservation, upward mobility of OBCs as well, where the backward class reservation, thanks to the Mandal Commission report and its acceptance in 90s, all that has somehow made upper caste very anxious, and over the years they have been able to mobilize their prejudice, able to mobilize their wrongful hatred and ideology into a political force, and that's the result which we see today. Now, the impact of this prejudice, the politics of prejudice we see is that the rising assaults on the lower caste, rising sexual assault on Dalit women. The case of Dalit women in Hathras is very, very fresh in our memory. It has been almost a year and nothing much is happening. And in fact, today's newspaper, if we talk about, is been talking about how the family who lives in Hathras village is very, very fearful about their own security, and forget about the justice which is nowhere seen to be coming. What I'm trying to say here, despite of police coming into action, despite of courts coming into action, despite of people pursuing these criminal cases, justice is nowhere to be seen because the ideology of Brahmanism, pushed through the politics of prejudice, mobilized through politics of prejudice, is so very entrenched that the whole thing looks absolutely hopeless. And how to counter that hopelessness, how to win over the people, how to try to make semblance of things where the politics of prejudice can be somehow arrested, can be countered. This is something I will turn myself to next, and we will see what possibility exists where we'll be able to counter this politics of prejudice. So this resultant impact of politics of prejudice has led to attack on our education institutions. One has to go back to what happened in our at Jamia University a couple of years back in the context of anti-CA protest and the upcoming NRC project. And one can go back to the violence committed against the students and student union leaders of JNU. One can a bit go back from there as well and see how the students, leaders from JNU have been arrested in the charge of sedition. And attack on the employment, the unemployment level in the countries are it's the most abysmal level. And the attack on the sense of security of Dalits, of Muslims, of different religious minorities and different marginalized sections of the country. This all has been the ideological agenda of the politics of prejudice as informed by Brahmanism. Now, how do we counter this political culture? How do we counter this politics of prejudice deeply seeped into Brahmanism? Now, one way, of course, has been, which our forefathers towards run-up to India securing independence from colonialism, has come up with the progressive, inclusive constitution, has come up with robust arrangement into the framework of the governance structure. One way definitely has been this, that we will gradually be able to bring people out of this heinous, unequal social relations, and people would be able to see the other side, and perhaps things will improve. And not saying that impact of constitution, that the constitutional democracy path is completely irrelevant. No, I'm not trying to say that. However, what I see is that politics of self-respect, politics of dignity, politics of tolerating each other, I somehow think that it's not working. Not to say that we must completely throw the baby with the bathwater. All these politics are very important, but it's not working because all these things requires an agency of an other. You want respect, you require an other to grant you respect. You want to be tolerated, you want definitely an other to tolerate your ways of living, tolerate your worldview, and so on and so forth. So this liberal setup, which is very, very important, and which has brought this country to today to some level where we can have this conversation, is not working thanks to politics of prejudice. Again, I'm coming back to the fact that the nature of prejudice and what has flowed from it is so deeply deep-seated and shaped and influenced people's behavior, people's social behavior, that somehow these important achievements, an important aspect and important tools of politics is somehow not been able to make its way ahead. So what do we do? Now, one commonsensical way to my mind is that when prejudice is mobilized, the counter to prejudice can also be mobilized, must be mobilized rather. There's no other way. What I'm trying to say here, we need all the more an intense ideological struggle where the progressive political forces, the progressive individuals, progressive non-political forces all have to come together to certain common minimum program where we must come to an agreement that there are certain things which are non-negotiable. Keeping all our politics, differentiate politics intact, we must come together to save that non-negotiables. And to save that, one has to mobilize the progressive section a big number. And we can only invoke constitutional in a peaceful democratic setup where we have democracy. I am afraid to say that seeing the level the government is functioning, especially for past 4 or 5 years in the second stint of this government, it doesn't look like that we are in a democratic setup. Every institution has been squeezed, arm twisted. Media, less said about that is better, and is completely mollycoddled and arm twisted by the government forces. Now, what do civil society, what do political forces who believes in a kind of semblance of democracy and liberal equality, what do we do? So one way is to mobilize counter prejudice forces, to mobilize people. What I'm trying to say here, we have seen the examples of this in South India, and of course in parts of Maharashtra where people like Dabholkar and others who have been part of this Andhvishwas Unmoolan Sangathan and anti-superstitious groups, and the kind of politics which has been initiated and very successfully brought in by Periyar in Madras and in Tamil Nadu, which the dividend of which we can see dividend politics in today's as well. So where one takes this intense ideological struggle in almost in sense of social movement, almost in sense of trying to complete the unfinished enlightenment movement which never took place in the north parts of this country. So that is one way in resolving those tensions emanating from deep-seated social prejudices which are no longer just confined to society but has got themselves converted into political force. And that political force can only be countered to some level if we try to mobilize ourselves in a very intense ideological manner to counter that prejudice. One of the most important element of this mobilized politics against prejudice ought to be is that there should not be any compromise against countering the forces and ideological nature of Brahmanism. And how does one do that? There can be some simple formulations of that. For example, we have Dalit political movement in this country. It's not that Dalit political movement is absent, but the nature of Dalit politics today somehow getting into the real politics of the things. It's somehow losing the ideological battle. So when we talk about this intense ideological struggle which must be fought to counter this politics of prejudice, and when you're trying to say that one has to mobilize the countering forces to counter to mitigate this the impact of politics of prejudices. One of the example which we see is very clearly available. It's not that people haven't thought about it, mobilizing themselves against the right-wing forces, against the obscuranted forces. It has always been there. Dalit movement, Dalit political movement is a prime example of that. However, seeing past 6-7 decades of seeing the politics of representation, that's what something I think that Dalit politics somehow has seeped into politics of representation rather than its primary motive, primary ideological objective of achieving politics of social justice. Now, politics of social justice, by the way, that is going to be one of the most important condition if we want to come together and want to defeat politics of prejudice as represented by BJP RSS today. This has to be one of the most important political glue of bringing all the progressive political forces to come together. Coming back to Dalit political movement, of which there has been some important political parties, my reading is that this politics of representation, which has been given by Constitution, whose task was to ensure that the Dalits have representation in the legislature bodies. I somehow think is not meeting its political objective that it has been set out for. Uh, every political party today have Dalit and Adivasi representation for that matter. But has that been guided towards the political objective which this community needs? I have my reservation, doubt about it. So what has been missing? One thing is that we must recognize that politics of representation is not going to completely resolve the problems emanating from caste as a system. Politics of representation can definitely give us a voice in a particular place, a voice in important legislative and political spaces, but it's by itself it's not going to completely counter and completely diminish the overreach of Brahminism and the politics of prejudice which has brought us on our face today. So one has to come back to politics of social justice. One has to talk about that how we are going to achieve this social justice politics through bringing everybody else, through bringing common people who believe in common goals, common political objectives, and then trying to make this common kind of a platform where we can start from the basics all over again, where we have to challenge politics of prejudice at its very a basic level, where it attacks and it impacts people's psychology. Now, having said that, another important element which we should remember is that politics, which has been there in the words and the writings and the ideological force of especially Jyotiba Phule, Periyar, and Ambedkar, all these has a tremendous guiding force to accommodate the kind of mobilization of politics against the prejudice, and it also has been successful in other parts of the country so far. That has to be an important ingredient of whatever a political shape future movement can take place. This is going to be one of the important part of this prospective social movement. Now, in this reimagination of politics, in this realignment of new political forces, if it become a possibility, without which it's going to be very difficult to counter this huge ideological assault which we are facing, one way is to reimagine our roles, especially intellectuals among Dalits, not just from a university education, but also in the vernacular mediums, in the huge presence of Dalit intellectuals in regional towns and states, who has a very important role to play over here. And I think students, intellectuals among Dalits, activists, all have to come together to work out, to reframe, to rethink and reimagine this politics among Dalits, the politics which for the time being can come to table to win important goals without which whatever we achieved so far in the past 7 decades is going to be completely futile. This little battle which we have been able to manage and achieve some decent, dignified position in past 70 years, if we do not wake up, if we do not mobilize ourselves, if we do not come together, those achievements of past few years, past couple of decades, are going to be absolutely useless. Sometimes I really think, and I talked with my colleagues, I talked with my fellow friends, that whatever differences Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Nehru, all of them had back in the days in 50s and 40s, and they had tremendous divisions and differences among those, rather conflict as well. But I'm sure the kind of India they all perceived, the kind of nation they perceived in their minds, and they've been able to, with their limited agreements, disagreements, they've been able to achieve that kind of nation. They gave the rubric of that nation to work toward that and achieve what has been the guidelines of which have been laid out. But seeing the reality today, it all looks like we are back to square one. Or rather, we are inching towards the more pristine and the glorious quote-unquote Hindutva kind of a system where only the caste Hindus can enjoy their privileges and powers and entitlements at the cost of the marginalized sections, Dalits, women, everybody else. And this cannot happen in a democratic country. This cannot happen. Our struggle to defeat this politics of prejudice is all the more important in the sense to reclaim constitution. the constitution which has brought us till here till today, and if we do not come together, if we do not bring these forces together and understand the reach of this ideological Brahmanism and the politics of prejudice which it has unleashed on us, it will be difficult for us to reclaim the constitution as well. So for us, the battle to defeat this politics of prejudice is basically battle to reclaim constitution, and I think it's a very important battle to wage in the coming days. For us, one thing is absolutely certain, that in order to defeat this politics of prejudice, we don't have any option but to come together, because there are a lot many important achievements are at stakes here. And one of the most central thing which is at stake is the constitution of this country. We cannot let that completely trampled by these obscurantist right-wing forces while we sit and don't do anything. So this battle is not just to defeat the prejudice politics, is not just defeat the obscuranted forces, but it's also a battle to reclaim our constitution back to us, to reclaim the constitution back to the people. And I think this is going to be a very important battle in the coming years.